disturbing. There is a small stone object that has been photographed, zoomed in on, argued about, and shared millions of times, and almost nobody who shares it has ever read what the people who carved it actually called it. It shows up in the hand of a winged being on a palace wall in Iraq that is nearly 3,000 years old. It shows up on a pillar in Turkey that predates farming, predates pottery, predates the wheel. And somehow it shows up again on a carved stone slab in Mexico, on the other side of an ocean, held by a man sitting inside the open jaws of a serpent. Same rigid handle. Same square base. Same grip. 3 continents. No agreed-upon contact between any of them. People online call it the handbag of the gods, and they ask the same question every time. What is a god from 4,000 years before Christ doing carrying a designer tote, and what in the world is inside it? Stay with me, because the honest answer is stranger than the conspiracy, and by the end of this you will never look at those palace walls the same way again. Before we go any further, there is a detail that changes everything, and I want you to hear it now instead of at the end. Nobody has ever dug up a physical version of this object. There is no ancient handbag sitting in a drawer at a museum in London or Berlin or Baghdad. What exists are carvings, flat images pressed into stone by people living centuries and sometimes millennia apart. So when a video promises you that scientists have finally opened the object, understand that you cannot open a picture. What you actually can do is read the words the people who carved these images left behind about their own rituals and look closely at what the carved figures are doing with their other hand. That second part turns out to matter more than almost anyone talking about this online has noticed. Let's start where the object is easiest to see clearly, because that is where trust gets built. Head to the banks of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq, to the ruins of a city the ancient world knew as Kalhu and modern maps label Nimrud. Around 28 centuries ago, this was the administrative capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, one of the most militarily dominant states the ancient Near East ever produced. At its center stood the palace of King Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from roughly 883 to 859 BCE. He was as devoted to construction as he was to conquest, and the palace he built was designed for one purpose: to make every visitor feel small. Walk the throne room in your mind. The lower portions of the walls were lined with massive slabs of pale gypsum, carved in low relief and once painted in colors long since faded away. These carvings were not decoration in any casual sense. They were propaganda cut into stone, meant to strike fear and reverence into every foreign ambassador, tribute bearer, and nervous local governor who was marched down that hallway toward the king. Scattered through the carvings, repeated again and again like a drumbeat, are figures that are not quite human. Muscular bodies wrapped in fringed robes, thick bracelets on their wrists, and enormous feathered wings rising from their backs. Some wear the horned cap that marked divinity in Mesopotamian art. Others have the heads of birds of prey, with hooked beaks and blank, staring eyes. These beings are known from Mesopotamian tradition as the Apkallu, semi-divine sages said to have lived before a great flood and to have handed down the foundations of civilized life to early humanity: writing, agriculture, ritual, craft. On the palace walls they function as protective spirits, stationed like sentries to guard the king and purify the space around him. And in the left hand of many of these figures, held low and easy the way you might carry a shopping bag without thinking about it, is the object everyone online is obsessed with. A container with a flat, square base and a stiff, arching handle rising above it. The proportions are so consistent, carving after carving, that a modern eye immediately files it under something familiar. It looks like a bag you could buy in a store today. That single resemblance, a 3,000-year-old Assyrian spirit apparently swinging a handbag, is the entire reason this mystery took off online. Once your brain decides it's looking at luggage, it wants to know what's packed inside. But look at the other hand. Almost nobody talks about the other hand, and that is the whole key to this mystery. Raised up near the chest, aimed towards something, most of these winged figures are holding a second object, small and tapered, shaped a little like a pine cone. It isn't just being held. It's being extended, pointed, offered toward a stylized arrangement of interlocking branches that Assyriologists call the sacred tree, or sometimes toward the king himself. One hand carries the container. The other hand reaches out with the cone-shaped object. That pairing, one hand low with the vessel, one hand raised with the cone, is not incidental, and we're going to come back to exactly what it means, because it is the detail that quietly dismantles the entire mystery. For now, picture the whole room. This wasn't a single image, it was a procession. Dozens of these winged guardians repeated down the length of the hall, standing at doorways and thresholds, at every point where the Mesopotamian imagination believed evil was most likely to slip through. Their placement was not random. They clustered around the throne. They lined the corridor a visitor had to walk, and their entire arrangement functioned like a spell cast in stone, a permanent, tireless act of protection running around the clock, whether anyone was watching or not. Whatever that object in the left hand actually was, it was placed at the literal center of the most powerful empire on the planet at that time, repeated across hundreds of individual carvings by different sculptors over decades. The Assyrians did not carve things carelessly. If the shape had been trivial, some artists would have gotten it wrong, eventually simplified it, changed the proportions. Instead, the square body and the arched handle stay locked in place, panel after panel. That kind of enforced consistency tells you something was considered important enough to get exactly right. Now stretch the timeline back much further, and this is where the story stops feeling like a curiosity about one empire and starts feeling genuinely eerie. Travel roughly 500 miles northwest into the hills of southeastern Turkey to a site called Göbekli Tepe. This is one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the last century, a complex of massive carved stone pillars arranged in rings, built by hunter-gatherers with no writing, no metal tools, no wheel, and possibly no agriculture at all. Its oldest layers have been dated to roughly 9,600 BC, not 9,600 years ago, but that many years before the present era, putting the total age at somewhere around 11 or 12,000 years. These pillars were raised by people living at the very edge of what we consider recorded human history. One of these pillars, catalogued by researchers as Pillar 43 and nicknamed the Vulture Stone, is densely carved with animals. Vultures with wings spread wide, a scorpion with its tail curled, snakes, birds, and shapes scholars still debate the meaning of. Near the top, arranged in a neat row, are three small carved shapes, square bodies, each topped with a curved arch. To a modern eye that has just spent time looking at the Assyrian reliefs, these look unmistakably like the same handled container, carved roughly 7,000 years before Ashurnasirpal was ever born. Sit with that number for a second, because it's the real engine behind this whole mystery. 7,000 years is a longer stretch of time than separates the Assyrian palace from us today. When those Turkish pillars were carved, there were no Sumerians yet, no Egyptian pyramids, no wheels rolling anywhere, no written language on Earth. There is no plausible route by which an idea from Mesopotamia could have reached backward across that gap to reach hunter-gatherers in Anatolia. And yet, there they are, three handled shapes staring out from a scene the world's leading archaeologists still can't fully interpret. The obvious question follows immediately. How can the same shape appear at both ends of a 7,000-year silence, with no traceable connection between them? Logically, there are only two broad possibilities. Either two unconnected groups of people invented a nearly identical shape completely independently, or some piece of knowledge somehow crossed that gap in a way archaeology hasn't yet found evidence for. It's in that uncomfortable space between those two options that the more dramatic theories, a forgotten global civilization, visitors from elsewhere, take root and start to feel plausible. And the shape doesn't stop traveling there either, because next it turns up on the opposite side of the planet, in the humid lowlands of what is now the Mexican state of Tabasco, at a site called La Venta. This was a major center of the Olmec, the civilization often described as the cultural predecessor to the Maya and the Aztec, famous for the colossal stone heads with their heavy, deliberate expressions. La Venta flourished somewhere between roughly 1200 and 400 BCE, overlapping in part with the very same centuries as the Assyrian palace on the far side of the globe. Among the carved monuments left at this site is one archaeologist's label Monument 19, a rectangular stone slab showing a seated human figure wrapped in the coils of an enormous serpent, its open mouth arching over the man's head like a hood or a doorway. The seated figure has one hand raised and one hand resting at his side, And in that resting hand is a container with a square body and a rigid, curved handle. The same silhouette on a continent that, as far as mainstream archaeology can currently demonstrate, had no direct contact whatsoever with ancient Mesopotamia. The geography here is almost absurd to say out loud. La Venta sits something like 7,500 miles from Nimrud, across oceans, mountain ranges, and thousands of years of civilizations developing in near total isolation from one another. There's no known vessel that carried Assyrian artistic ideas to Mexico. There's no tablet anywhere in the Mesopotamian archive that references anything on the far side of the Atlantic. And yet the object in the Olmec figure's hand and the object in the Assyrian sage's hand look, to an untrained eye, and even to some trained ones, like the same tool held in the same grip. Once you've lined those three images up, Turkey, Iraq, Mexico, it becomes almost impossible not to start seeing the shape everywhere else too, and people online have. Some point to Maori oral tradition, which tells of the hero Tawaki ascending into the heavens and returning with baskets of sacred knowledge for humanity. In some versions of the story, 3 of them, echoing that row of 3 shapes on the Turkish pillar. Some point to a symbol used in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, a squared enclosure with a domed line rising over the top, which scholars generally read as denoting the dwelling place of a god. Some point to painted tomb scenes where Egyptian deities are shown holding small containers whose exact purpose the paintings themselves never spell out. Lay all of that side by side, an 11,000-year-old Anatolian pillar, an Assyrian palace, an Olmec monument, a Polynesian myth, an Egyptian symbol, and the pattern feels less like coincidence and more like a signal. That difficulty in dismissing the pattern is exactly what gives the bigger, wilder theories their staying power, and it's worth taking those theories seriously rather than mocking them, because the underlying observation is real. The strongest version of the argument goes something like this. Human cultures build differently, dress differently, bury their dead differently, and imagine their gods with entirely different faces. So when 2 societies with no plausible connection produce the exact same specific object and attach a similar meaning of divinity or sacred knowledge to it, that level of precise agreement seems too exact to be accidental. Something, the argument goes, must be threading these cultures together, either one older, larger civilization that spread its symbols worldwide before vanishing from the archaeological record, or some kind of shared contact remembered by witnesses who tried to carve what they saw as best they could. It's a compelling story, and it deserves a fair hearing rather than a dismissive eye roll, because anyone looking at these 3 images side by side feels the pull of it. But a serious theory has to survive its hardest question, not just explain its favorite piece of evidence. And there's one question the lost global civilization idea has never been able to answer convincingly. If one culture really did spread this symbol across the entire ancient world, why is a single container basically the only thing that traveled with it? Where's the shared alphabet? Where's a common system of measurement, a shared building technique, a matching calendar, a scattering of loanwords bleeding from one language into another? The kind of debris that real cultural contact always leaves behind in abundance. When 2 ancient societies actually meet and trade, they don't hand each other one lonely symbol and nothing else. They swap crops, diseases, loanwords, gods, techniques by the dozen. A civilization sophisticated enough to seed the same symbol on 3 continents but leave behind exactly nothing else isn't really a civilization at all, in any meaningful sense. It's a shape. And shapes, as it turns out, have a habit of getting reinvented independently by people who never met, for reasons that are almost disappointingly ordinary. To understand why, we have to go back to that second hand on the Assyrian reliefs, the one holding the small cone-shaped object, because that's where this entire mystery actually resolves. In carving after carving, the winged Apkallu isn't just carrying a container. He's reaching toward the sacred tree, or toward the king, with that cone pinched between his fingers, angled